Editorial. While united armies were battling back the endless hordes of greenskins and the Wulin were finally bringing aid to them to help turn the tide of battle, another conflict was about to take place far behind enemy lines. Knight Warden William of Acshire was making his move now to cut off the head of the snake, so to speak. He'd made his way to the rear camp of the orcs and was seeking his quarry, the Warchief. Now, most Warchiefs do have names, but I'm not entirely sure what this one called itself. I'm sure that question was far from William's mind in any case. This is from an excerpt from his log after the battle. Looking back on it, I can't say I knew precisely what I was expecting, but I also felt a sense of satisfaction when I saw the orc camp. It was disgusting. Huts made of rough animal skin and even dead orc skin from the color. Small bonfires littered the area, and there was an awful stench. I wondered if we might have been getting close to their defecation pit of some kind, or whatever these barbarians considered a good place to leave their fecal matter. Orcs don't really believe in such niceties as toiletries or compost piles. The average orc will simply relieve themselves wherever they stand. William gives the greenskins far more credit than they deserve. Whatever the smell was, we had to push it from our minds. I had taken only a handful of warriors with me to this fight, all highly skilled assassins, shinobi, loyal to the Dawn Empire, a few peacekeepers of the noble and royal legions, 2 shaman from Valkenheim, and at least 6 berserkers. Though not nearly as subtle as I'd have liked. Knowing how brutal the orcs were, I was thankful for their savage approach to battle. They all remained silent as we moved toward the camp. Thankfully, the greenskins seemed far more interested in the main conflict itself to even notice that a team of intruders had come into their midst. We paused beyond a strange bone-made torch, and I looked at the shinobi at my side, a young man named Nagato. "We must draw out the Warchief," I whispered to him, "but we also must weaken the orcs themselves if we're to be successful." "I suggest you allow us to sow chaos within the camp. This will draw the attention of your target. Then you can engage him quickly and mercilessly," Nagato answered firmly. I nodded my response to him. "But will you be safe? You are engaging a small army of these beasts." "Life is but an illusion," Nagato quoted the old proverb of the samurai. This proverb is one popular among the samurai and the Maya. I am told that it is a philosophy of theirs in terms of how they view life and death, that mortal life has little to no merit, and that it is far better for one to embrace this. In this way, the samurai know that even when they die, it is no great loss. If life is but a fleeting illusion, then death is merely awakening from it into true enlightenment. I find this philosophy quite thought-provoking, if a little funny. "Fine," I sighed. "Do you have a plan to go about it?" "Does the snake teach the rabbit how it kills?" Nagato asked, a little frustration in his tone. I was swiftly reminded that Nagato, like several members of the samurai and Vikings, still did not see me as a friend, merely a temporary ally. Of course he wasn't about to spill ninja secrets to his enemy, regardless of circumstances. "Now's not the time for keeping secrets," a berserker snarled, shooting daggers at the ninja. I smiled at him, glad to know I at least had one supporter beyond my kind. I believe his name was Anders. Nagato gave a disapproving snort, but then looked back at the battle. "We're together or we're dead," I added harshly. Nagato could no longer argue this, recognizing full well he stood no chance against the orcs without some cooperation at least. "I will take the more agile of us through the camp and begin assassinating those that do not notice us. As we go, the peacekeepers will plant their bombs in key locations that we pass, like weapons caches, sleeping quarters, food supplies. And once the bombs detonate, the more ferocious of our number, namely the savages from the north, will begin directly engaging those we did not pick off and are now aware of our presence. They will be disoriented and confused by the explosions. We shall use that to our advantage and strike through the fire." We listened, and we nodded. His plan was sound, but there left out a key detail. "And what happens when the Warchief emerges?" I asked. "He will rally his forces, and we'll be overrun," Nagato explained. "That is why you must seize the moment and put him down before he can do that." Anders placed a hand on my shoulder encouragingly. "You keep your mind on the boss. We'll handle the rest." I found myself liking Anders. Nagato, though, just shook his head. "Just don't slow us down." He then turned to his shinobi siblings and the peacekeepers, and they all darted off in different directions of the camp to sow their special brand of discord. I went down on one knee and waited for the sound of combat to begin. Meanwhile, Anders slid closer so that he could whisper. Night Warden, I'm not from Hrafnfeld, but all of Valkenheim knows of your actions, he said. You spared the daughter of Reynald. You defended Hrafnfeld from the invasion of the green monsters, and you became Reynald's own shield brother before his death. Even now, Ayala speaks of your nobility and your virtues. You flatter me, I answered, not sure where this conversation was headed. I tell you this because I feel you should know. Unlike that pissing ninja, we all admire you. He turned to his berserkers and shamans, who waited behind him, all nodding with wide grins. You are one worthy of Valhalla, and to die in battle at your side would be our deepest honor. You might be a knight, but you're a brother to Valkenheim. I was again reminded of the hidden nobilities of the Vikings, but something about what he said concerned me. What do you mean die in battle? That's rather pessimistic, I asked. When the fighting starts, Anders explained, we will be your vanguard. Let us clear you a path, and don't look back. I now began to realize their strategy, a fitting one that I have come to expect from the Vikings. They would rush the enemy headlong, laughing at death as their kind often does, all in their attempt to see me to victory. Why did so many see the need to throw their lives away like this? The psychology and philosophy on death differs so vastly between the factions that it may actually be a large part of why they have been in such ceaseless war. The samurai believe that death is preferable to dishonor and disloyalty. Life is beautiful, but it's fleeting, and for this reason, a warrior should not fear death, but rather embrace it as a part of their fate and destiny. To cling to life is a coward's practice. The Vikings believe that death itself is not something to fear, but only the manner of one's death should be a concern. A Viking longs to fight and die in glorious battle to earn the favor of their deities. A Viking who lives well and dies well is accepted into their vision of paradise. A Viking who dies old, feeble, and weak is not welcome in the halls of warriors. For them, honor is won through how one is prepared to die. But for the knights, life is a precious thing. For them, death on the battlefield is only noble if done in service to someone higher than themselves. To a knight, self-sacrifice and the laying down of life for another is the most virtuous form of death. To a knight, there is little to no honor in merely hurling yourself at the enemy for the sake of killing, but only in the defense of someone else. This stark difference in outlook may be one of the underlying causes of their animosity towards one another, but what they all hold in common, that there is honor in death, is what may yet unite them. I silently nodded to them, and then turned my attention back to the camp. Within moments, suddenly, I heard a series of explosions. The greenskins went into an uproar, and I saw several begin running around wildly, searching for the source of the disturbance. That was our cue. Ander rose to his feet, and with a roar of Valhalla, he and his fellow Vikings charged at the enemy. The shamans were faster, running wildly at the enemy and hurling themselves at the greenskins, pouncing on them and ripping at their throats with their teeth, as if they were wild dogs. The berserkers were moments behind them, snarling savagely. Axes bit into green flesh. The orcs, bewildered by the sudden onslaught, took a few moments to comprehend what was going on. Some even began striking each other, as if confusing the savagery of the Vikings with their own kind, and thus attacking one another. But it was only a few seconds before what little reason they had returned to them, and they realized what they were actually up against. The berserkers never went on the defensive, ducking in and out of the swings of their foes, and making them pay with gnarly blows to their legs and guts. "Go, Warden!" a shaman shouted as she pierced an orc through the eye. As it howled in pain, she let out a savage laugh at its death, and turned to pounce on yet another enemy. I took her advice, and ran past the battle. A few orcs began to bear down on me, only for sickle-like weapons to suddenly snare them and yank them backwards. The shinobi had returned. I tried to glance at them, but I may as well have tried to see the wind, for instead of seeing the shinobi themselves, I only saw the impact of their attacks. Orcs fell with sick gurgling cries as blades pierced their throats and heads. I saw one moment where an orc, trying to get into the fight, was blasted off of his feet by a nail bomb, and then a peacekeeper was swift to strike him down for his lack of foresight. The assassins had created their chaos, and now I was running through a mob of confused and disoriented orcs to get to the center of the camp. Any orc that came too close was hacked down by a Viking, a ninja, or a peacekeeper. But even without looking back, I knew our good fortune wouldn't last. I could hear the screams of pain as a few shinobi were finally caught and crushed by the orcs. One peacekeeper I heard let out a cry of anger and pain as her stomach was ripped open, and the shaman, though just as feral and ferocious, lacked the armor to hold out long, and soon both were devastated. Only a handful of our original number were holding on. I had to find the Warchief and fast. It didn't take long. He towered like a great mountain. He was almost twice my height and built broad and stocky. Massive tusks grew from his underbite, and he wore a loincloth that looked made of elephant skin. His green muscles bulged, and I knew not even our lawbringer's armor, the strongest of our people, could even hope to hold against this monster's strength. He let out a few roars of fury at his compatriots until he noticed me. He drew a great axe that could have been my size, and without a second's hesitation, he was upon me. Blocking or attempting to endure his blows was a gargantuan effort. My bones rattled with each swing of his weapon, and when I parried his strikes, it was like holding back 3 Shugoki guards at once with nothing but my arms. The steel on my sword groaned from the weight, and I winced as I was forced downward. A few of the orcs had stopped attacking my comrades and turned to witness the duel. None of them interfered, which, the more I consider it, is quite surprising. Given their savage and bloodthirsty nature, why didn't they all join up and destroy me on the spot? Because orcs have a crude but stern sense of hierarchy and status. If the orc underlings had interfered with the Warchief's fight, it would have been interpreted as a show of disrespect to the Warchief. It's the equivalent of saying that they don't think the Warchief is strong enough to win. By interfering, they risk their own necks, since the Warchief would likely punish them for that insult. In a culture, and I do use that term loosely, that values strength and aggression, it's always good to remember where you are in the hierarchy, and when not to step into the business of your betters. I had to take advantage of this. I didn't have time to worry about why the other orcs didn't involve themselves. Fighting just this one monster was struggle enough. He roared at me with each murderous stroke. Finally, I saw an opportunity. He swung downward to cleave me in half, and I sidestepped. I then chopped down on his left hand. My sword buried deep into his wrist, and the Warchief let out a howl of pain. But to my horror, I hadn't cut all the way through. The sword was stuck halfway through the monster's arm. The Titan pulled back his hand and took my sword with it. I realized with a sickening realization that I was now unarmed. My sword was still deep in the beast's arm. The orc rounded and, with his good hand, prepared to strike me in half. I threw myself to the side and then charged him, slamming my shoulder into his navel and trying hard to tackle him. I may as well have been a toddler trying to tackle a grown man. The orcs were almost laughing at my attempts to overpower the green menace. The Warchief bellowed and kicked me off as I rolled, feeling the ringing of my own armor. He reached down with his injured hand and held my body down as he raised his axe with his good hand. I saw my sword, still in its wrist, just out of arm's reach. I tried reaching for it, tried desperately to grab it, but I wouldn't reach it in time. I knew that, yet I tried anyway. Suddenly, I heard a shrill scream, and I looked up to see the Warchief howling in agony, as a long polearm was now buried in its back. I followed the trail of the long weapon shaft to see a Nobushi at the other end of it. But not just any Nobushi. "Ayu!" I gasped. Had she followed us? Had she come to make sure I was safe once again? Ayu looked terrified, scared out of her mind that she was surrounded by the enemy, and yet had done the unthinkable, charged through the crowd to ensure I didn't die. The orcs were howling and bellowing in rage. I had no time to think. In no time, I knew they'd be on top of us. I used that moment to wrench my arm free. I grabbed my sword and pulled it out from the arm of my foe. The Warchief turned to attack Ayu, and I rose to my feet. I would kill him. I had to kill him. I ran to the beast and swung with all my might at his calf, slicing clean through the leg. The Warchief fell to his knees in agony, and then, with all my might, I plunged my sword deep into the back of his neck and out the front again. With the sword now sheathed through his throat, the Warchief gurgled, looking down stupidly. And then I yanked out the sword as if tumbled forward, life ebbing away from it with a pathetic gurgle of blood. I didn't wait to see if he would get up or die. I swiftly decapitated the monster, its head rolling off its defeated shoulders. Ayu looked dazed a moment, as if unable to believe what she'd just seen. But we had no time to celebrate. I raised my sword, ready to defend us both from the furious and vengeful orcs. But to my surprise, the orcs began shouting and roaring at each other, which quickly devolved into hitting each other, killing and maiming one another in a mad brawl, as if they'd completely forgotten we existed.
"What on earth are they doing?"
Ayu cried. "I can't fathom these beasts," I answered her. Again, this is the hierarchy at work. Orcs are mindless brutes by nature, and only the strongest is allowed to be Warchief. With the current Warchief dead and no Orc successor to take charge, the Orcs are now vying for control of the War, and no Orc wants to look like the weaker of his fellows, so inevitably, and obviously in the case of a greenskin, diplomacy and dictation is swiftly abandoned for primal violence and combat to determine succession. Indeed, this is quite often what brings an end to most wargs. Eventually, the Warchief is betrayed or killed, and the Orcs begin fighting each other until they end up destroying themselves. "We must retreat, now!" I insisted to Ayu.
What about the others? The assassins and our comrades? We can't just leave them behind.
We didn't have a choice, though. We didn't have time to go back and look for them. I wasn't sure how long it would be before these beasts came down on us. I took Ayu's hand and retreated fast. I could only pray that the assassins escaped, but as I ran, even that thought, shameful as it is now to admit, was driven from my mind. Ayu had saved me again. She'd come for me even now. A part of me was ashamed that I couldn't defeat the Warchief on my own merits. But on the other hand, I was too happy with her now to feel concerned about that. As I write down this memory, this log of my battle, I still am not sure what happened to the assassins, though I pray they made it out safely. I hear her steady breathing as she sleeps in my tent not far from me. Ayu is exhausted, and besides, from what I can hear, the battle has turned heavily in our favor. It seems it was all for the better. William is likely referring to the fact that he was hearing the Orc lines beginning to break. News of the Warchief's demise travels quickly, and the Orcs began to falter, not out of fear or demoralization, but rather a mad rush to find out who would be worthy to lead next. This shift allowed the warriors of Heathmoor to push back against the green tide, not to mention the timely arrival of the Blue Dragon Corps to help spearhead a counter-offensive into the left flank of the Orcs. Within the next 3 Terran hours, the Orcs were being routed. I myself was more than a little impressed and pleased by this turn of events. Or, granted, I was at the time. I would come to find out that, given the nature of the real threat resting beneath Heathmoor's surface, perhaps an Orc invasion wasn't such a terrible prospect at all.